Hello and welcome back to this first, I suppose we could say, special episode. Today I will not be covering the tank losses of the Russo-Ukrainian War during the next time block. Rather, I will be defending my methodology and my sources. I am doing this because there were several criticisms in the comments, and I expect that I will see such things, including the same criticisms, again in future videos, so I figure let's use the opportunity to just have a video that we can direct such critics to. The three criticisms, or at least two stated criticisms, and one that I'm adding for completion here, are bad sources, the ratio, and limitations for the databases. The subsets to the bad sources accusation is that it is pro-Ukraine sources and that there is rampant fake Russian losses. The primary allegations there being duplicates, so a single loss being reported as multiple different losses, and intentional mislabeling. Now, this is a particularly pernicious one because it isn't that a mistake has been made, it's that knowingly and maliciously the either databases or someone reporting on them, such as myself, are actively lying. It's perfectly fine to be wrong if you correct that mistake, and that's where the pernicious portion of this comes in. Because whenever data is found to be in error and is corrected, that is no longer taken as evidence of good scholarship, but as evidence of deceit. The second is the loss ratios. In this case, for that first about 5-week period, it's about 7-1, and that the claim is that that ratio is so high that it must demonstrate, as one commenter I think quite well put it, madness or malice, which I think is a fairly catchy phrase. This does also combine with the fake losses portion. The third that I've added, visual loss database limitations. This is not a criticism that I saw in the comments of the first video so far, but I expect it is one that will occur, and I think it's important for everyone to understand the strengths and limits of their either databases, their sources, or their data models. So, to get started on that first section, allegations about sources. Now, the primary sources that I use are Warspotting and Lost Armor. Warspotting is a Western source. It does not list Ukrainian losses, as they put it, until the end of the war. This is actually, at least philosophically, fairly well mirrored by Lost Armor, which is a Russian source, and it does not list Russian losses until, as they refer to it, the end of the special military operation. People are less familiar with Lost Armor because, well, a lot of people do dismiss it because it is a Russian source, and it is, in Russian. That does mean it's a little bit harder to use. I myself don't speak Russian, so I do have to rely on Google Translate for that, so I expect there is possibility for some error as a result of that. Other elements of showing that, it's a Russian source. Their daily updates cite the Russian MOD's own claims in their daily updates. And the rule number 1 on the website is any photo or video materials containing our 200s or 300s are prohibited. The punishment is a ban without right of amnesty. I expect that might be one of those translation frictions, but I think we can figure out the severe punishments that they have for anyone uploading such materials. And for anyone who doesn't know, 200s and 300s are code for casualties, be they dead or wounded, in the Russian military. Now, as far as Oryx goes, Oryx is also a Western source, but unlike the other two, it does list both Russian and Ukrainian losses, so should, in theory, use a similar methodology for both of them. Oryx has limitations, which I went over in the first video, and I will go over again later here, and that's why it's not the primary source that I use, but it is the most well-known source, which also means it is the most criticized source. So, in order to figure out a little bit more about these sources, let's compare them. So, I chose the date of April 20th. The reason for that is it is the first date that archive.org has a archive version of Oryx's Ukrainian losses page. There are older ones for Russian losses, but I need to take the same date. And in this, I am not including any tanks that couldn't be identified at all. And as you can see, if you take a look at the numbers here, Oryx and Warspotting are pretty close to each other. There's a bit more of a discrepancy in regards to the T80 numbers, and the T90 numbers have a fairly large discrepancy, but that's also the effect of there being a fairly small number of them, so the proportional difference is much larger. Overall, they're off by 20 tanks, and so that's less than 5%. So they're pretty close to one another, though they are both Western sources, so to an extent, you'd expect that. The more interesting thing comes when we compare Oryx to Lost Armor. And what we see is that Oryx actually estimates Ukraine's losses as about 35% higher than Lost Armor does at the same point. Now, we do again have a fairly large discrepancy when it comes to a base model that just doesn't have a very large sample size, but there you have it. For the date range of April 20th, 2022 and before, Oryx estimates the Ukrainians suffered more losses than Lost Armor did, which, remember, Lost Armor is a Russian source. So, if Oryx is intentionally misidentifying Ukrainian losses as Russian losses, how are they still estimating higher Ukrainian losses than the Russian source is? I would say they aren't. Now, you may come around and you may allege, well, that just shows how incredibly asymmetric the losses were in favor of Russia during this period. Although, I do have some questions about this. I'm not sure how a tank fleet primarily composed of T-64 BVs is destroyed and turns into a tank fleet primarily consisting of T-72 BAs and B-3s. But then there's also the somewhat more, shall we say, prosaic observation, is if Russia was inflicting casualties that asymmetrically on Ukraine, why didn't the war end then? So, if we can continue on the observation, assumption, whatever you want to say, that Oryx is not intentionally misidentifying Ukrainian losses as Russian losses, then I'd put forward Warspotting also isn't, because they've wound up at very similar numbers. But perhaps you still don't believe me and you'd like some actual evidence. So let's put this data set a little bit to the test. And to do that, we'll be taking a look at the T90A. Now, I'm using the T90A for a few reasons. One, during that first period, there's a fairly small sample size. It's 12 tanks. That's easy to review every one of them. The second reason is that they're pretty distinct from other tanks. Specifically, the Stora 1 IR Dazzlers are not quite unique to the T90A. Such IR Dazzlers can be found on a couple of other tanks, but these are pretty rare. We're talking T80 UKs and T84s. The T84 being the one in the lower picture, which, being a T80, has a few visual differences from a T90. For example, the number of driver's periscopes and what kind of road wheels it has. The third reason is that if we can identify it as a T90A, well, it's guaranteed to have been a Russian T90A, because Ukraine doesn't operate T90As, or T90s as a whole. And in case you still want to check my work, I'll include the Warspotting IDs, so you can go to their website, you can find the specific tank, and you can look at the other images of it that are on the site. To avoid cluttering things up, I'll only have the most useful 2 images, but like I said, check my work. I encourage you to. So we shall start with example 1, Warspotting ID number 632. The status claimed is that it is destroyed, which, considering there is an image of it on fire, is a reasonable conclusion to make. Its wheels are large with U-shaped indents and a thick rim, so it is not a T80. It's got Contact 5 and Relict ERA, so it's not a Ukrainian tank, and it's got Stora IR Dazzlers, the thing circled in red. So it's a T90A. Of that, I am confident. And just for completeness' sake, a brief description of its location. It's on a road next to a pole with a line of trees behind it next to a field. Example 2. Claim destroyed. With a separated turret, that's a destroyed tank, alright. Its wheels are large with U-shaped indents and a thick rim, so it is not a T-80. It's got Contact 5 ERA, it's a Russian tank. I am reasonably confident that what is circled in red is a Stora system, although I am not positive, so I went to look for another feature, in this case the smoke launchers. The smoke launchers on the left side of the T-90, modeled in the lower image, has a total of 6 tubes on 2 separate backplates. And as you can see, those on the destroyed tank are the same arrangement as the tank on parade. The most similar looking other Russian tank is the T-72B3, which has more than 6 on that position and are all clustered together, rather than in 2 subgroups. As such, I am confident that this is a T-90A, and it is located on a long, straight road through 2 wooded areas. Example 3. Now, this one is claimed to have been captured. It appears reasonably intact. It has a single large periscope in the center, so it is not a T-80. The front of the turret does appear to be too flat for T-72 variants, but that is a somewhat less conclusive identifier. Its turret has Contact 5, its side skirts have Relict. On some of the other images of this tank, it does include Stora, and those are Ukrainian TDF in the images. I've circled them in different colors so you can see those are the same groups of guys. Now, in total, this tank is shown in 3 locations. 2 of them are probably pretty close together. Basically, it looks like 2 places on the same road, and the other location is on display. So I'm fairly confident in this also being a T-90A, and I actually take the fact that it has multiple locations pictured, but are only recorded as a single loss as circumstantial evidence against the use of doing, say, the opposite, of having the same tank in different locations so you can claim it's multiple tanks. This was an opportunity to do that wasn't taken. Is it proof? No, but it is circumstantial evidence. Loss 4. Claimed to be destroyed. Considering again we see it on fire, reasonable claim. Those do appear to be Stora 1 on the turret face. Those do not look like T-80 wheels. It has Contact 5 on the turret, it has Relict on the side, so quite confident this too is a T-90A, and it's located on a road by a guardrail and some woods, then in a warehouse, and again displayed in public. Once again, an opportunity to claim one tank to be several tanks. Number 5. Claimed to be captured, it appears reasonably intact if pretty thoroughly bogged down by the mud. It has 1 large periscope in the center, so it is not a T-80. Its exhaust is on the left of the tank, so also not a T-80. It has Contact 5 on the turret and Relict on the sides. It has Stora, so quite confident this is a T-90A. Its locations are in the field and then later in storage. Number 6, claimed to have been captured, appears to be intact but bogged down on the side of a road. It has large road wheels with U-shaped indents. The number of indents are different than most of the others, but the 8 indent pattern is on use on T-72s and on T-90As. So it's a little less common, but you do see it. It has Contact 5 ERA on the turret, and I do believe what is circled in red is Stora, although it's not as good a view of them. And we can see that the tactical markings and the unit markings would indicate that this is most likely 2 pictures of the same tank. So this is one that I would consider moderate confidence that it is a T-90. We do also see the fact that it appears to have a meteorological sensor there circled in blue, which would indicate that it is at least a T-72BA. So even if this isn't a T-90A, it would still be a fairly modern Russian tank. Example 7, claimed to be destroyed, and considering the turret has separated and it burned quite aggressively, yeah, I'm gonna go with it's destroyed. Its exhaust is not on the rear, so it's not a T80. If it were on the rear, it would look like the smaller image offset to the left. Its turret has Contact 5 and Stora, so I'm confident that this is a T90A, and this appears to have been destroyed on a long road with woods to one side. Example number 8, claimed captured, seems reasonably intact and pretty thoroughly bogged down. Once again, the exhaust is not on the rear, so it's not a T80. It has Contact 5 and Relict and Stora, therefore I am confident this is a T90A. It is located in a woods between another tank and a BTR. Speaking of that other tank, number 9, also claimed as captured, appears relatively intact, but is pretty thoroughly bogged down. Once again, the exhaust is not on the rear. It has Contact 5, Relict, and Stora, so quite confident this is a T90A. Example 10, claimed to be destroyed. I think, yep, that checks out. Its wheels are not T80 wheels. Its turret has Contact 5 and it has Stora. Now, these two images do show, or at least seem to show, a reasonably significant time change between the two of them. But considering the somewhat more distinct way in which the third wheel was separated, can be used to correlate these as the same tank. Once again, a pretty good opportunity to duplicate your losses that wasn't taken. Example number 11, claimed captured, appears reasonably intact, with one large centrally mounted periscope, meaning it's not a T80, with Contact 5, Relict, and Stora. Its location is in a woods somewhere, and then another image of it being on a road. So, pretty confident this is a T90A. Number 12, the final one, claimed captured, visually at least seems intact. Pretty confident it's a T90A. It's got Stora, it's got a single periscope. Now, this is an interesting one because it was uploaded September 29th, 2022, hence the much higher ID number. But it is dated as the loss having been first evidenced on March 31st, 2022. Why the photo took so long to make its way into the database, I couldn't tell you. It could have been floating around on the internet and just didn't make its way to the database for that time, or it may not have been posted for quite a while after the photograph was taken. So I decided to take a little bit more of a look at this one. It is claimed to have been destroyed on the same road as example number 7. This road runs past Herny, or I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce that in Ukrainian, but it is a town to the south of Sumy. Now, the Institute for the Study of War estimates that Russia withdrew from the area around April 2nd, so this loss just predating that would check out, so it is at least plausible. So, what is my conclusions having taken a look at those 12 T90s? No tanks are being misidentified as T90As. These all are what Warspotting claims them to be. In addition, these losses do appear to have all happened at roughly the same time of year. The trees are bare, generally the sky is overcast, there's plenty of mud, and there's occasionally snow. I would say this is not likely to have been in the same period of time in the following year, as by then the T90As are fairly uncommon, having mainly been replaced by the T90Ms. I also believe that there's no obvious cases of duplication, and someone's going to claim that all of the captures are actually duplicates because they're moving a captured tank around and photographing it to make it seem as though there are more. But even if that's the case, then there are at least 2, because there's 2 of them in one photograph. And in case anybody wants to argue that the destroyed tanks are also the same tank being moved around the place to create the impression of there being multiple, well, considering that tank has multiple different kinds of damage, including whether or not it has a turret, and which wheels are missing, or in some cases, section of the hull, I'm gonna say that that is an unreasonable amount of work to allege someone is going to. Is it possible? I mean, sure, but, the odds aren't exactly in your favor. Now that I've addressed the sourcing validity, let's talk about that ratio. The claim being 7-to-1 just doesn't seem like a reasonable loss ratio, and I agree with that. It's not. But Why does that seem to have happened, at least when we compare the databases? Well, this gets into a little bit of the final section, but most Russian troops don't seem to have had their phones when the invasion started. This reduced the number of opportunities they would have had to have taken photographs of destroyed Ukrainian equipment. If a photograph isn't taken of something, it's not going to show up in visual loss databases. And, as was somewhat shown by T90 example number 12, photos can be taken much later than the event actually occurred, and can't always be correctly attributed to when the loss actually happened. Sometimes it's just whatever the closest date they have is. This can artificially delay when a loss occurs in the timeline, and while this should even itself out as time passes, it's going to have the largest impact for the first time period, because it may have losses delayed later, but it isn't later than another time block for that block's losses to be delayed into it. But there is also another factor that goes into that ratio. A special condition that was going on at the time. Mud. For any of you who have particularly studied your history of wars in Eastern Europe, you will know that the change of seasons throughout the Ukrainian region is rough, to say the least. And these environmental conditions coincided with that early Russian offensive, and, more importantly, the withdrawal was also beginning during this time period. Now, the reason that's important is that Russian vehicles that get stuck in the mud while, well, doing anything really, may have had to have been abandoned and thus counted as a loss, whereas a Ukrainian vehicle doing the same thing in the same area, also getting stuck, would have been recovered by Ukraine, and so wouldn't be counted as a loss. So in some ways it's a loss category that really only affected the Russians. Are there going to be exceptions of Ukrainian vehicles? Obviously. But it's pretty predominantly just the Russians suffering from this permanent loss of a vehicle due to mud. And to give an idea of just how prevalent this issue was, during that first 5-week period, Warspotting claims about 150 Ukrainian captures. Now, by no means are all of those functional, but take that as it is for the moment. Of those 150, 50 of them were visibly bogged down, detracked, or some other way mobility killed. That's pretty large as far as total numbers. And many of those other vehicles may also have been mobility killed, just for a less visually obvious reason. So if we return to that 7-to-1 ratio, if we remove those as casualties to mud, we now have a 6-to-1 ratio. If we assume that the Russians were half as likely to take a photograph as the Ukrainians were during this period, that now brings it down to 3-to-1. Now, 3-to-1 is still an asymmetric casualty rate, but it is a lot more in line with historical data, particularly historical data that, say, I don't know, involves the significant gain of territory during an offensive, and then the withdrawal through that same territory. Those aren't cheap military actions. Now, I'm not saying 3-to-1 is actually the correct ratio. No one's going to know the actual ratio until after the war, and probably not until well after the war, and to be honest, I expect is going to be bitterly argued over for decades to come. So now, the final point. Limits to visual loss databases. I've a little bit gone over some of these already in the video, but in order for a visual loss to record something and for useful data to come out of that, a bunch of things have to happen. First, a photograph or video of it has to be taken. This is why, at best, you should consider this a floor, because there's no way everything is having a photograph taken of it, even with all the cameras available right now. Now, as far as sorting that data, the next thing is that it has to have the correct date. Now, this is something I've already covered, is that when something is uploaded, it will be initially assumed to have been lost at the date of upload because it's the only date information they have. If more information becomes available, or more information is available with the original upload, it will be recorded at the earlier, more appropriate date. This is something that Lost Armor and Warspotting are able to continuously do to improve their datasets. But because Oryx is a list, and if you want to get timeline data with Oryx, you have to use archives, you can't do that with Oryx. The loss will only ever be attributed to when it was uploaded. This is a primary reason that for these kinds of analyses, I don't use Oryx, because that data ends up being really messy. The next thing is correct location attribution. Now, for what I've done so far, that's not all that important. But if in the future we do some sort of analysis regarding the loss patterns in a particular area during a time period, as a way to try and figure out how intense that combat was, for example, trying to figure out the Battle for Kyiv or Bakhmut, then obviously having location data is really useful. The other stuff that it relies on is that it's been correctly identified. Some vehicle features are really determinative. Noj, Contact 5, Relict, these are pretty exclusive to one side, so if you see it, you know what side is using that vehicle. There's also things like the T-90, which are exclusively Russian vehicles. Some things are somewhat determinative. A T-64BV is probably Ukrainian. Not guaranteed, but it's a fairly safe assumption. A T-80BV is probably Russian. Not guaranteed. Here are two examples of a Russian and a Ukrainian T-80BV, where it's basically the paint job is the only thing you can differentiate between them. So you have to look for other information if they aren't wearing their particularly identifying paint schemes. And to an extent, that will rely you to trust your sources. Trust that the location claim is accurate. Trust that the claim as to who was operating it was accurate, because you don't have any way of checking it. Some vehicles are fairly inconclusive. Either side could be using a T-72A. We know both sides had them in reasonably large numbers in stockpile. That's all you've got to go off of, so you are entirely reliant on further information or getting lucky. Of course, the accurate databases require there to not be duplicates or misidentifications. A good database should continually be revising its lists, removing bad data, adding back in good data. This is something I may actually include in the future for some videos as a end of the presentation slide, showing the changes to the reported numbers during each time frame as a indicator of this continuous revision process, that it is actually happening. But that will bring us to the end of this special episode. I hope that this has demonstrated to you guys that I'm not just making numbers up. I'm not just blindly following the claims of the respective ministries of defenses or random commentators on Twitter. This stuff is actually sourced. This stuff is actually researched. And even if you disagree with some of the conclusions that I draw, I hope I've at least demonstrated to you guys that I'm attempting to operate with you in good faith, and that I'm not just trying to deceive. Because once we can get past accusing each other of lying all the time, we can actually have productive, useful conversations, which, let's be honest, is far more rewarding. See you next time. Bye-bye.